This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so I'd like to join Jennifer Seo and Laura Ahola-Young. They both are featured in the Learning Resource Gallery here at College of the Sequoias in the exhibition called On Closer Inspection. Both artists are well exhibited, and they will share more about their work through some images, and we'll hear from both of them, and then we'll have an opportunity to have some question and answer at the end. So hopefully there will be some exciting questions from the classes that are currently being streamed. Um, and yeah, we're excited to hear from both of you, and look forward to getting more information. Let's see. Maybe we'll start. Maybe we'll start with Jennifer, if you don't mind, and then we'll switch over to Laura if want to share a little bit more, and we'll get going.
Right. Hello. Thank you for attending and listening. I guess I'll share my screen now. And if you give me 1 second to, no, just kidding. There we go. Hello. Again, my name is Jennifer Seo. I teach painting and drawing at Gonzaga University, which is in Spokane, Washington currently. I started my college higher education sort of journey at McLennan Community College, which is in Waco, Texas. And from there, I transferred to Baylor, mostly because that was the closest thing. That was the only university in town. And but I wanted to start there from having got out of Baylor. This is my BFA show in 2014. And I wanted to start here because this was the first body of work that I made. I made a body of work without really knowing what that meant, just because I was told I was supposed to have a body of work, right? And they were really large drawings that what I was doing was I was trying to observe interesting shadows and fold shapes. And then I would draw them on a large paper, and then I would fold the paper to sort of mimic the shadow shape and the folds. And I had a lot of fun doing them. They turned into these really dimensional things. Here's me working on one back in 2013 for scale. This is what that drawing turned out to be. And it was like 4 feet tall by 5 feet tall by 4 feet wide, and it protruded out of the walls about 1.5 feet. And again, they were really fun, but I didn't really know why I was doing these things. And as I graduated with this work, I had a little bit of a crisis, right? Because I was graduating with a painting degree, having made drawings that stuck out of the wall like sculpture. And so, like, what the hell am I doing? And it was desperately impractical once I got out of school. I didn't have the wall space. I didn't have the storage space. And those impracticalities, because I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing, there was no real motivation to push forward to overcome any of that, right? And so about 3 years of having this, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not making any new art because whatever reason. I decided to go back to grad school, and thankfully I was accepted into University of Texas in San Antonio. And remember, I'm still having a crisis about being a painter, right? And having to be painterly. So then I decided to go back to basics. I've got to paint some still lifes. And I think I read a book on Cezanne, and because he has ideas about painting, and he painted a bunch of apples. So I made my version. And in doing this, I printed out, I made the still life of apples, and then I printed it out, and I folded a version of the still life setup, and then I painted that. And again, I had fun doing it, and I'm trying to figure out what is painting and drawing for me. And what I learned from this exercise is mostly that I enjoyed the distortion of it, right? The reinterpretation of it, the sort of taking an object in the round, flattening it, and then recreating it as an illusion. So then I took the idea of distortion and I went, so it's flattening, it's sculptural again. And I was like, let's run with distortion. So I made this thing where flowers are still life. So I thought, sure, I'll start with flowers. And I painted a bunch of flowers. And then I took away the original reference of the flowers. And I was looking at the version of the flowers that I had painted. And then I was trying to recreate another version of flowers from the painted flowers. So I kept doing that. I was making copies of my own copies until it turned into this sort of just blobs of color. And that was really interesting, that I was finding out this sort of gestural mark making was really lovely and poetic. And of course, I'm still fighting the it's a painting or it's a sculpture, and I had to like literally break the frame, right? This is grad school ideas, and anyway, it's fine. And at the same time, I had read something about time, and I had this idea of like, oh yeah, mark making is this really poetic thing that it's like visual records of time, and it's this compression of all of that. And I thought that was lovely. And I was wondering, how do you pull the work completely off the wall and make it much about the process of making the mark? So I made these little, they're not little, these origami vessels, I guess. And they're of giant paper again. I can't stay away from paper, apparently. And I'm dipping my hands in ink and I'm folding them. And as I fold them, the sort of literal action of folding them is turning into this mark making that's also ornamenting the surface, right? So it's about like surface texture that the mark making is creating. And they sort of look like urns, and there's a door for scale. What they were referencing was these little ceramic jars that are used traditionally for fermenting food in Korea. And I liked that sort of insertion, a little bit of this recognizable object. I liked that it was paper again, and I liked that it was fragile again, right? But when I made this work, I had all of these things that I liked about it. I kind of liked that it sort of referenced this ink painting because it was Black. But I put these in the room and they were so present. And that's weird to say, but the dark value of the charcoal and ink that I was using just had a really heavy, weighty visual. And it felt like it was fighting what I really liked about paper. What I liked about paper and mark making was that it was delicate and fragile. And mark making is this like, if it's a record of time, time has this idea of being really elusive and like slips away. So I wanted that really light, ghostly visual, and this didn't quite do that. So by 2020, I'm experimenting with a bunch of things, and 2020 is when I graduated grad school with, this is my MFA show, and I'm experimenting with different materials, different kinds of gestures, different kind of mark making. This was part of the show. I'm also experimenting with the level of mimicry the object is doing. And I'm also still hung up about being a painter, right? So I made my version of a Wayne Thiebaud, which one of my heroes. But anyway, and then I'm also trying to mess with the idea of scale. So like, what is life size? And for it to be life size, like this is a life size picnic table, and it's an elaborate pedestal for these. If you see on what would be the top of the picnic table, little dots. And it was supposed to be this upside down elaborate pedestal to house these little tiny paper pumpkin seeds. And I so wanted just the pumpkin seeds to be the work. I wanted it to be really intimate and like approachable. But then I also was under the pressure of like, I have to make a really big bang MFA show. So I made this giant thing that was a lot of effort. Anyway, it just wasn't as successful as I thought it could be. And I'm experimenting with different materials, like I said, so much so that these are little porcelain fortune cookie rattles that were on the bottom of these vines that sort of turned into seed pod things, which I enjoyed making. But what I thought was the most successful were these ghostly objects that had color pencil or painted, like very translucent painted marks on them. And what I mean by successful is that for me, it hit all the notes of what I wanted the work to do and how I wanted the work to be read, right? There was something about the picnic table was really fun, but it was really elaborate in a way that was really sort of punchy, and like it was literally sparkly around it. And I like the idea of sparkle, but I don't want the literal sparkle. So I'm trying to figure out what it is my visual language is. And these sort of fit that. And how I came to that was I had recently discovered Agnes Martin. I had read about Agnes Martin, and she has this, she's a lady that paints giant, very complicated grids. And that's all it is, just flat grids. And I loved, at first, it was really hard to get into the idea of why would you just paint a grid or draw a grid? But then there was this idea of this very laborious, meditative, repetitive process. And it's about focus, and it's about that hand that is immediate, and that drawing offers, like only drawing offers, about that, like this very ephemeral mark making. But anyway, so I made my version. And when I think there's a pattern here. When I find something interesting and I find an idea that some other artist is doing successfully, I try to reinterpret that into my version. And there's something learned from that. And I figured out, like, for me, it was that contrast of this ultra tidy organizational method of a grid versus something so like ephemeral as a pencil mark. And it's literally about the hand autographical mark making, right? And that like contrast was really lovely to me. So I try to apply all of that into making the object, and that's what these turned into, right? So I'm applying the grid. It's about observing, but it's about taking it off and reflattening it, it's reinterpreting the object, etc. And so by the end of grad school, I had formed some ideas to the questions that I had about painting and drawing. And it's that the repetition was really interesting, that allows for variation, right? I ultimately decided that drawing is about observing and abstracting. And in that, there's a loss of information, right? We're always trying to make a thing appear, but it is reaffirming that it's flat when it's so illusionistic, right? And that's an interesting conflict to think about. But anyway, also about like poetic mark making, right? So that, and from that MFA show, my favorite piece in the show was this tiny little bowl that's 3 inches by 3 inches that had these little paper towel paper towel rice, because I fidget, right? And I was fidgeting one day and I was rolling these things, and I looked at it and went, they look like maggots, but they also look like little rice balls. And I was like, I should make more. So I turned a kind of like fidgety habit into the work, and that was interesting contrast to this very, very planned object. But that became this catalyst for what I now call drawing sculptures, and that's what's on view at the library of College of Sequoias. And for about a year or two since I graduated from grad school, I kept experimenting with different, construction methods and different, line quality. Here's a better version of that first bowl, right? Different materials in fidgeting with making little fidget rice. And I just made more objects. And I made objects because I thought some of them had really interesting shapes. But I also and making sure to sort of play with the flatness and dimension of things. But I was also making sure to pick objects that were very sort of mundane, everyday objects, right? Things that we take for granted, things that we handle, right? And I thought that was important because I wanted the drawing line component to be a bit more apparent in that sort of poetic way, right? This grid line that is bringing this object forth and recreating it to be reiterated by the form of the object that is also about being touched and like handled and in that way like momentary. But after a while I started to fall, not that I was like running out of things to make, but I had a little bit of like, sure, everyday objects that we touch, but then like it could be anything. We literally sit on and touch on everything. I needed some sort of structure in thinking about what objects to make. And that's when I discovered this giant stack of old family photographs that I somehow inherited. And they're not all of, I mean, they're all of my immediate family, but like they're older. I'm not alive for a lot of these photographs. So I don't know where they're from. And I don't sometimes know who these people are completely. But those were interesting, right? This sort of record of time that is like, again, distant. So the idea of photograph as an object was interesting. So I made the object and then I thought, well, sure, why don't I just look at the objects in the photograph and make some of that? And that's my sort of new rule. And these are, so like this pair of duck is from this particular photo. And that one actually is of me right there. And on the very left side of the photo, there's this little wobbly black dot, right? And you wouldn't know what that was if you didn't know what it was. I don't know if that makes sense, but I saw it and I was like, oh, that's a wooden duck. And I think my husband was next to me looking at it and he was like, what the heck? It's a black dot. And I thought that was interesting. Like I was able to see this and immediately decipher what it was, right? Sometimes I have to look at it for a while to like almost rediscover what the objects are. But that process of observing something and recognition and not recognizing was something that was interesting. So I had to continue to incorporate these photos. But anyway, these ducks are a traditional wedding gift. You sort of, whenever somebody gets married, you give them a pair of wooden hand-carved ducks. And here's another one for a similar reason. I want to explain the object to the photo a bit because I start to discover a kind of logic behind how I'm recognizing things. Here's a photo of an orchid plant, so like that silhouette that is cut out is of my mom. The child next to her is not me. I don't know who that is. But above the child is this little fuzzy pink stuff. Those are orchid plants. And I saw the orchid plants and I was like, oh, they remind me of these traditional orchid ink paintings. And I was like, I should make the orchid plants. But I made the photo first and I showed my mom and I was like, look, you're in it. And she was so adamant that she didn't want to be in it. So I took her out of it. And then I made the orchid plant because that's what it was about anyway. But having took her out, there was a lot of discussion about why or why not she didn't want to be in the work. And it was, she had this like enormous nervousness and anticipation about being seen, right? And it turned into a whole discussion about her coming to this country and like trying to figure out how to be present without being like too observed. And it was this very strange conversation of this like self-imposed diasporic erasure. And in that was a whole nother thing that I was starting to grapple with. But the photo object also became a more interesting object to have a hole in it, right? It was much more apparent that it was a sculpture and drawing. But so then that became the sort of new rule. only children and dead grandpeople are now present and recorded in these drawing sculptures. But what I thought was interesting in that conversation, where I'm removing these people that have a conflict about being seen, but I am looking at these photos because I'm reaching out to find connections of things that I am trying to preserve, right? So I chose to make that orchid plant because it reminded me of a traditional ink painting, right? And now I'm starting to pay more attention to what objects do I find interesting and do I recognize and have the want to recreate. Here is a back scratcher, and I made it because the name of a back scratcher in Korea, or the word for back scratcher, is, if you translate it literally, is filial hand, right? And I thought that was rude. So the little bit of like, if you have a back scratcher, your child is not doing their job, apparently. But anyway, so then I'm being more conscious of like the objects and how I ornament the objects. Here is a very traditional vessel shape that is very sort of traditionally Korean. And it's usually ornamented with a pattern of cranes, and I replaced the cranes with little paper planes. I grew up in LA, and there was a lot of first generation friends that I had, and we would endearingly call them fobs, which meant fresh off the boat, but we changed the boat to pihengi, which was the word for plane. And we thought we were being clever. It was kind of rude, but there's a like weird moment of like language being translated strangely, and we're trying to like hold on to these things. But anyway, and then I usually inevitably get questions about processes, but I have hit my 20-minute mark, so I will save that for if we have time after questions or during questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Maybe we'll switch over to Laura. I've got notes, so I will have some questions, at least for me to ask. But
all right. Are you ready for me?
think so.
All right. Well, first I want to start by saying thank you to the College of Sequoias for being able to show and talk about my work. And Jennifer, that was fascinating. Jennifer and I have not met, but our work has met, which is really interesting to me. I'd love to go see the show. We have some definite things in common, which is a love for Agnes Martin, drawing, and yeah, I think you'll find what we have in common. I sort of have two plans in this talk, and one is to try to talk to students about what might be interesting to them, and also about my process. And I'm starting here. This is work from 2020, where I had this artist block that I hadn't ever really had before. And I also want to say who I am. So I'm a professor at Idaho State University. I am from a small town in rural upstate Minnesota, where it's often the coldest place in the winter. I usually start my day by looking at the weather there, and I didn't today, but it's probably 10 below. So it's a town called Ely, Minnesota. It's at the edge of the Boundary Waters. And when I was growing up, the only thing I thought I was good at was drawing and painting. I still sometimes think that, but I've proven to have some other skills in life. But I think I developed those skills through drawing and painting. Anyway, in 2020, I had this block. I was very despondent. I was alone because of COVID. I wasn't teaching, and teaching is really meaningful to me, and I missed my students. And I had just visited a grad student who grew up in Tehran, and I was in her house sitting on these most beautiful hand-tied rugs, and I said, oh, I want to paint these. And then I decided that was sort of cultural appropriation. So I came home and I decided that for my 50th anniversary, for my 50th birthday, I should commemorate that with doing shag drawings. So I did a series of work. Whoops, I just skipped through the whole thing. I'm going to stop well, just ignore all this. So part of my practice is obsessive mark making. And I think you can see that. So I was despondent because of COVID, politics, turning 50, thinking about the environment and things that hadn't changed. So I just decided, yeah, I should just try to figure out how to draw shag carpeting, which is a little bit insane, but it got me out of my artist block. So one thing that I thought I'd share with students that I don't always talk about in a, what is this? In an artist talk is I suffer from a neurological condition normally known as migraines, but if I say the word migraines, a lot of stereotypes come up. And I have suffered from migraines since I was 15 years old. And there are moments in time where I can't make my work because of intense pain. But what I can do is sit down and draw. And I can make the same mark over and over. And my work is so important to me that I'm always finding ways to not give up. And so drawing to me is a practice of being mindful and paying attention and being okay with just making the same mark over and over and over again. And the shag carpeting became important because I heard everybody's stories about growing up with shag carpeting. And at some point, I would just like to make a book about how the 1970s, people's lives organized around shag carpeting. What I was interested in at the time, and I still am, is that how ideas, viruses, natural forms spread, right? And so I love talking to my family, my aunts, my parents, what they thought was a good idea about shag carpeting, right? What is this that you thought was so attractive that every house, and then I started thinking about how shag carpeting, like where is all that now in the landfill? But I heard so many stories about shag that it was actually kind of fun. And
So it's easy. I could connect with these speakers instead.
okay, that led me to the first time in my life because having a sabbatical from my job. And I'm a mom, so I have kids who are post-college. And it was really the first time in my entire life where I ever just got to be an artist. And it was really daunting, right? I wasn't a student, I wasn't a teacher, I wasn't a mom. I got to focus on me. So I decided I knew nothing about algae. And a lot of the shag carpetings kind of reminded me of algae in a way. So I contacted a lot of scientists who are phycologists who study algae. And I really wanted to uncover this one idea about algae and, well, about climate. I wanted to understand as an artist, what is carbon? And then I also wanted to understand, well, what is oxygen? So I went to an art school. I went to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design for my undergraduate degree. And I went because I wanted to draw and paint. I also went because I didn't have to take math. And I didn't have to take science classes. And I knew that. So I have since discovered in my life a deep love for science that sort of started with my daughter who has dyslexia. And she decided she wanted to, when she was 12, that she wanted to be a scientist, get a PhD, and make scientific discoveries. And so I had to read a lot of science with her because of her dyslexia, and it kind of changed my life. And so in trying to understand oxygen and carbon, I worked with phycologists. I worked with phycologists at in Canada and in Colorado. I just sort of randomly emailed them and set up these relationships where they explained to me. So I did a series of drawings that were based very specifically on algae research. So every one of these algae pieces started with a drawing and it translated into painting. And I think some of these are in the show there, that if I had time, I would unpack all the scientific information embedded in each one of these. And Jennifer talked about poetry. And one of the relationships I have with science is when I read science texts, I have a hard time remembering all these facts. I take notes and notes and notes, but I understand science is poetry. And I often try to figure out the difference between poetic truth and scientific truth. And I love bothering a lot of the science faculty on campus with bizarre poetic truths to see if they think it's scientific truth, and sort of the division and the relationship. So one of the things I did when I was on sabbatical is there was a part of me that decided to just leave the humanities behind. And I came to a place in my work where I wasn't at all interested in my personal narrative. I wasn't interested in expressing myself. I sort of became what I considered an ambiguous scientific illustrator. And it is a little bit going back to that artist block and the despondency with the shag, trying to figure out what role I thought art played. And I have come full term. So in the beginning of the sabbatical, I moved home to Ely, Minnesota, this small town at the edge of the Boundary Waters. I lived in a 1968 Shasta travel trailer that my husband ripped down and rebuilt. So I lived in an 82 square foot house with no electricity for 6 months, including in the winter. And I had a studio that was 4 feet by 6 feet. That was an ice house, traveling museum that was closed for the year because of COVID. So I had this very small space. And at the beginning of the sabbatical, I was on an online Zoom residency about plant science, which sort of changed everything. So I became engaged in a theory called critical plant studies, which is looking at plants through the lens of how we talk about plants, how we see plants, how we tie plant science with the humanities. And I sort of quickly abandoned the algae work to try to figure out how to some new ethical questions I thought were important in thinking and talking about climate change. And the biggest one, so many of my friends and academics think is so radical that I believed I was onto some new kind of poetic truth. And that is, what is the ethics? What are the ethics of representing plants? Right? Like, that is a very strange question, but it changed the way I think. So the role of critical plant studies is to think about how we uncenter the human from our dialogue and narrative in talking about and understanding plants. So if I wanted to pursue that, it raised a new complication. Like, well, what if I'm an artist and I want to draw and paint plants? And now I'm asking about the ethics of representing plants. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. So I spent a lot of my time thinking about this and stopping again, a little bit of a crisis, not a block necessary. So if there's students listening, I know my students often struggle with artist block and imposter syndrome. Those are the two things that come up all the time. And I'm not sure that I ever feel imposter syndrome because it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I draw. I draw in meetings. I'm having a hard time not drawing as I talk to kind of settle my anxiety because as a migrainer, I often say the wrong words, which is great in my teaching because my students love to catch me. But I'm always drawing. So if I'm always in the practice of drawing, then I don't really think I'm an imposter because the only way I can actually travel through reality as a sane human being is to draw. It helps me be present. But for imposter syndrome, as long as I'm making, then I'm doing something. And my relationship with my work, I teach like 30 hours a week, but I draw and paint about 40 to 60 hours of work. I don't have a life. So my students are trying to teach me how to have a life, but I don't. With imposter syndrome, if students are thinking about that, just keep doing it, right? Just keep making marks. Just keep making marks. Incidentally, one of the things I'm deeply studying right now is Generation Z, because I feel a cultural divide between myself as a 50-year-old and my young students. They're teaching me about popular culture. everything that you do or say is important. Just keep making the marks. And especially when you're Gen Z, I know there's a lot of despondency out there. I just want to tell the students it's your role to change the future of the art world. You have things to say, and we have been through a collective trauma, and there's no imposters in that. We were all in that together. So I'm gonna go back to the work for a moment. This was I'm also making a series of work where I've decided that maybe someday I could be a textile designer. And my goal in that is to democratize plant science, because I think plant science is really interesting and it's really hard to access. If any of you have ever tried to get through a scientific research paper, it's not easy. And so every one of these squares is either based off of a photograph I made or from a scientific image I found online that I contacted the scientists themselves to get permission to use the image. And I've made a lot of friendships this way. This is a plant called Monotropa uniflora, otherwise known as the ghost pipe plant, which is supposed to be almost impossible to see in the wilderness. So of course, I went on a 2-year quest until I found it. And the plant is a parasite. And it's not a fungi, it's a parasite that takes its carbohydrates, its sugars from a host, from another plant, and it pops up and it grows until it's upright. It flowers once and then it dies back to black. And there's a lot of mythology about how we as human beings are not supposed to spot these. Incidentally, back to poetry, when I was in 5th grade, I remember falling in love with Emily Dickinson. And I remember my professor reading her poetry to us. And she always had the book facing us, and Emily Dickinson's face was always in this oval, right? And so on some versions of this, so it's all hand drawn, but I put it together on Photoshop. In some versions, I have the wallpaper of Emily Dickinson's bedroom in the back. And I'm saying this because Emily Dickinson's favorite plant was the ghost pipe plant, Monotropa uniflora. So it sort of brought me back to my love of poetry and where that came from through her. So I did a series of plant patterns that at some point I will put on Spoonflower and try to see what happens with them. And these, during that sabbatical, I also had a visiting artist residency at the Denver Botanical Garden. So I left for a little while to go spend time at Denver, and it was an amazing experience. And so all of these are also kind of based on my traveling through that space. And these are all hand-drawn. The tiling, though, would happen in Photoshop. And I think by now I might have proven my my obsessive drawing that I do over and over and over. So I thought I'd talk about a little bit where I am now. I know I'm talking kind of fast, but I know that there's students here, and I'd rather talk to students about questions if they are brave enough to ask Jennifer and I. So in thinking about this question about what are the ethics of plant representation, I noticed that in my collection of photographs that I hoard photographs that I take. I am just in trouble because my university is getting rid of my Google storage space. And it's a bit of a crisis. They're probably changing the rules because of what I personally own myself. I mean, if a student sends me a painting, I never even get rid of that image. But I noticed over the years that I have taken the same photographs of fallen trees in the Boundary Waters, probably since I was in my early 30s. And that these fallen trees have become a monument. Like when I walk through the same trails, these fallen trees are what I actually see. I don't see the live trees. I see these monuments, and I pay attention to the decomposition and what's happened. And it sort of also answers the question of well, I can represent plants that are no longer alive, right? Because that's more ethical or not. But then part of my research is a lot of reading and a lot of reading about science and a lot of contacting scientists to ask them, what does this mean? Like, what is this word? How do I understand this? Why don't you all write so anybody can understand this? And then they say to me, well, why can't all painters make paintings that we can understand? Right. So it's a lovely conversation, but there's actually more life within a fallen tree than there is in a live tree. There is more cellular life within a fallen tree. So the Boundary Waters canoe area is my home. I now live in southeast Idaho in the high desert, and there really aren't trees unless they're planted, and the trees we have here are these junipers or invasive species like the Russian olive. And yes, I have a guilty pleasure of loving the Russian olive tree. I think it smells amazing. So I am in a landscape that I'm looking out the window that is sort of deprived of trees and water. And I do go home now every summer and live in the Boundary Waters. And one of the things that is happening to the boreal forest, so where my hometown is right at the edge, is the tree line is marching north, right? And so the landscape is changing. And then one of the ways we see it is by the amount of trees that have sort of fallen on the forest floor. And luckily the land is sort of preserved and these trees are not disrupted and they're allowed to decay and give back to the forest. But sometimes they're removed. So my work is sort of an examination of forestry practices as an artist and trying to figure out what are the best ways forward with forestry practices. I just got into a residency that I shouldn't admit this in case this is publicized, but I'm going to learn how to do prescribed fires as part of this long residency. And so I'm going to be out there. So right now what I'm sort of thinking about is forestry practices. So these, I'm looking at the time to make sure we have like 10 minutes for questions. So this is where I am now in my process and what is happening in my studio at the moment. I typically try to do 20 pieces in a calendar year. Some of that happens over the summer because of and that's a goal. And for the students, what I want you to know, so this is the largest one, is I say I do 20 pieces, but this weekend was my fun weekend that I set everything out and decided 6 of them were never going to live again, that they were going to, I'm either going to cut them up, I'm going to put them in a fire. Agnes Martin is an artist that I've looked to who she has not left anything behind that she does not want seen. And so I think part of my practice as an artist that saves me is that I don't get attached to everything I do. I have no ideas that what I'm going to make is going to be perfect or interesting or finished. Sometimes it's painful because I don't know if I can zoom in on this, but and you can see in the work at the gallery that for me to get rid of a piece might be hundreds of hours of mark making that I'm saying goodbye to. And I think that's okay. I think one of the annoying things that as an artist that you always find is everything I learned as an undergraduate remains true. And it's the process that matters and not the finished piece. And I also have this idea that the more intimate I am with a piece, the easier it is to let it go in the universe and never see it again. So letting it go out to galleries or burning it, it doesn't matter to me. I put the time in. But sometimes it bothers a lot of people in my life. It's like, you spent 2 months developing that. Yeah, okay. I see my students wanting to do everything perfect all the time. And I just say, just keep going. Turn it around. Don't look at it. Don't worry about it. Start another one and let that go. And eventually they get there. But it's really hard when you have limited time and resources to think about that. So I always also tell my students is be cheap, get some cheap paper, get some cheap pencils and just go for it. I'm not, you know, I know my students' resources are more limited than mine. So I think I'm going to stop so there's time for questions, but I want to say thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both Jennifer and Laura, for sharing about your work. Maybe we can open it up to if there's any of the classes that are currently with us. If there's some questions from any of those classes, I don't know about Ramon, Charles, or Matthew, or even Corinne. I know you don't have a class right now, but you joined us from your office. Any questions?
I have a question. I know I popped in with each of you because
Our tech support from the behind the scenes.
yeah. So I might have missed if you already answered this or not, but from Jennifer, I'd like to hear more about your process of ideation and coming up with your ideas. I remember like you talking about the not being seen thing was really interesting. So like touching on how you developed that idea. And then with Laura, like how do you get in the process of getting a residency and finding this pursuit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the not being seen thing I thought was the conversation that came from was from my mom not wanting to be part of the work. And I mean, it's not like we didn't have these conversations before about her life as an immigrant, right? But why it stuck out and why I thought what it was tangible to the work, because I was already thinking about the ghostly visual of the work, right? I was thinking about the material that I really enjoy working with and the fragility, which is paper, and the fragility of the paper. And I was trying to make sense of why fragility of paper is important to the work. And so the ideation process takes many, 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 many iterations, and it takes many, many in like looking at the work and like critiquing it myself, and also trying to introspect on what I find to be important and successful, which is kind of hard when you're in school, especially in grad school, when you have 5 different professors telling you very different opinions and directions. But it was in hearing very different directions, you get the opportunity to like consider it and say no to things. And I think that's something that I maybe want to maybe not encourage, but like to consider, right? When you get a whole bunch of directions, and if it doesn't sit right, if it doesn't do the thing that you want the work to head in the direction of, say no to that feedback and critique. Anyway, but in that I'm dealing with the fragility of paper, and that's why I went to translucent paper. It was visually more delicate and fragile, because any paper is all delicate and fragile, but it was important that it was visually that. But it just sort of, my inclination to want things to be fragile and visually lightweight and visually ghostly, in addition to this, like, I love how you were saying this, the repetition of mark making. I think that's important. And the repetition of mark making for me also becomes this thing that like deconstructs, right? I'm still constantly making marks and then remeasuring them. I intentionally use a very blunt color pencil. So as I draw it, it sort of like disappears and disintegrates, and then I have to sharpen it again. It rehappens. And then I have to like fold these really chunky marks. So then I have to remeasure, and it's this like repetitive process of doing this over and over again. But in that, those things that I find to be interesting, that having that conversation with my mom about the work, it clicked, I think, of the sort of, not that the work literally has to talk about, oh, this is about not being seen, right? It doesn't have to be overtly that, but if it has this visual of airiness, right? I am alluding to a kind of subtle visual, because I find that idea of her not wanting to be seen or having the trouble of being seen to be difficult. Like that parallel for me was important to know, right? That is something that's for me to hold on to make more work. I hope this is making sense. That's where that went. And how that develops is I keep considering what it is that I'm still trying to pay attention to, what I find the work to be, when I find the work to be successful or not successful. And for that is like how Laura was saying, you just have to make a bunch and then maybe say no to a bunch of your own work too. But yeah.
Were you asking me how I find residencies or why I engage in residencies?
Just your process of like, this is something that I want to research more, as an academic sense and as an artist.
Yeah, I often tell my students that I think you find your voice in your work when you're obsessed with something that's not the work. And I am absolutely, completely, strangely obsessed with plants. And I think it's because I'm not around a lot of plants anymore. And I grew up in this lush wilderness. And I'm always asking questions. Like my studio practice is not very much about answers, but always about questions. Like I have a list of questions that I'm always trying to figure out and ask the universe. And I have a limited amount of time to like take classes. But I do have scientific friends, which is really quite exciting. And my daughter helps a lot, but a lot of it is just like the next question, right? What is the next question? So I'm trying to think, for me, I can tell this story. So the next question for me is I called a friend who's a neuroscientist. He's a professor at ICU, and he's actually also practiced. He's like a master meditator. He teaches meditation, and I called him, and I have to let go of my own vulnerability and fear. And I asked him, I said, is this a poetic truth? I am starting to see plants as in a perpetual state of deep meditation. And he just paused for a minute. He's like, oh my God, let me write this down. And he's like, I can't answer that. I have to think about that. And then I asked him what the role of carbon is and what is the role of oxygen in meditation and how much of meditation is about breathing. And I'm still waiting for him to call me back. He's like, do you think we should write a paper together? And I'm like, oh, no. I just want to know if this is a poetic truth or is there some science to this? But I think not being afraid to ask stupid questions sometimes. Right, I have all these questions. What do I do with them? I am a lay person. You know, the most sciencey thing I do other than draw and paint is post something to iNaturalist, right? So to me, it's just always I'm drawing, I'm thinking, what is the next question? And what do I do with that? I think that as artists, we're lucky that we don't really need to have answers. I don't need to write a thesis anymore. I don't need to state it as fact. But if I can ask the question, then it leads me to the next question. And that is just how I operate. It drives my students nuts when I'm teaching. Well, what do you think is next? What do you want to do next? Why is it like this, right? But I also wanted to share this that I thought I heard you say about residencies, and my teaching and my own practice is so related that whenever I apply for something, I share it with the students. Just because I feel like teaching is, if I'm more vulnerable and they know I don't get accepted and then they see me move past that, I am modeling for that. And that is a change I've made over the last 10 years. And then sometimes they'll ask me and I'll be like, no, I didn't get that one, or yes, I did. But I think that's part of teaching too. Like if you're an artist, you have to just keep putting your work out there, and it doesn't matter how many years in there is rejection. And sometimes it stops you, but you just have to move on. So I often apply for things So I can keep this practice up with my teaching, right? So it feeds each other. It's like, oh my God, I got that. I really thought that one was going to be like a no-go, right? I thought that one was just going to be to model rejection for the students, and that has actually helped me get more opportunities. But it's really hard to be that vulnerable with students, right? So.
Well, I think what's so exciting when you both put in your application for potentially showing here at the college, the way that you both wrote about your practice and about like carefully observing the things that you were questioning and trying to, like in Jennifer, in your case, like deconstruct things that you were observing and transforming that drawn element into a dimensional form, but is still constructed as a drawing. But then also, Laura, the way that you were writing about how you were so like carefully observing like the process of understanding the world around you is through the act of drawing. And I so appreciate that, even though that the content of your works are very different, there is a relationship when seeing them together, that the dialogue of the act of drawing, both dimensionally and more like scientifically deconstructing what's being depicted. I mean, I know Jennifer's had the opportunity to see the work in person, but it's so exciting when those pieces come together. So I appreciate you both in being willing to be open to having your work shown together when it wasn't necessarily the intention of either of you. But I, as somebody who is a primarily drawing based artist myself, I always feel like I'm understanding the world through drawing and understanding my experiences through drawing. So I appreciate that both of you have shared so much about that. And I know there's so much more. We could talk for another hour about, I know there's is there any questions at all of either of them? I know some of the classes, they're going to be ending right now, but any last questions for any? I think there was a comment that was made, the process is what matters. Yes, absolutely. Thanks, especially when we're learning, and form is content. So yes, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments from any other classes that are with us? Yes, no? Well, I'd like to thank you both. I'll let the classes go if you two want to hang tight for a moment, but thank you both. And this will be recorded and shared, and I'll let you know when it is available.